I was born in 1943, in the middle of the Second World War. My father was originally trained as a lawyer, but spent his life basically as jogging between working in intelligence in the government and being a newspaper publisher when he was a civilian. Many of the journalists were very deeply involved with the CIA. It's probably not a good mix today, but it was commonplace. I think Phil Graham did CIA work, publisher of the Post, Washington Post. So there was a lot of back and forth between reporters and the intelligence community.
Interplay.
Well, journalists know a great deal. They're in an ideal spot to do spying because they're interviewing people and learning all kinds of things in the process. So it's not uncommon. It's not, and it fits. Now, whether it happens today, I don't know, but I just have no idea. But I bet it does. Well, I was trained as a lawyer, clerked on the Supreme Court for the Chief Justice in his last term, which was a wonderful year. I then went to work in a law firm called Wilmer, Cutler, and Pickering, sometimes referred to as willful, cutthroat, and nitpick. And I worked there for 12 years, became a partner. And then Reagan won the White House, and I was offered a job as counsel to then Vice President Bush, which I took, and I had a glorious 12 years in the White House when then he lost to Clinton. And I went back to Wilmer, Cutler, and Pickering for another 12 years. And then 43 came in, and I went to Brussels in his second term as ambassador to the EU. I had so many great opportunities when I was working for 41. It's hard to pick. There are 3 or 4 things I did that I was proud of and glad I did it and glad I didn't screw it up. But I think setting up the project for having the president pass on all the regulations in the executive branch, which he should be able to do since he's the head of the executive branch, and having the capability to do that was something that I established. It was a whole system set up right in the very beginning of the Reagan administration. There was a key executive order, which the first draft of which, or drafts of which, were written by me during the transition before Reagan actually entered the White House. But that still is enduring. It's still important, and that's probably the most long-lasting thing I did. I worked on judges, and I think I had an impact on that to this day. I don't know Justice Barrett, but I do know all the others. And I even had a hand in the nominations and confirmations of Justice Breyer and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I was credited by some as being the architect of the modern administrative state, and I did have something to do with setting it up, and I'm now busy as I can to make sure it doesn't go off the rails and sticks to what it was supposed to be in the beginning, and trimming it back and limiting the administrative state is proving to be very, very difficult. We have a government that's grown far too big. The first shoots of green grass were under Senator Kennedy, believe it or not, when he was chairman of the Judiciary, as helped by Justice Breyer, who was then a professor at the Harvard Law School. And that happened under President Carter. That was the beginning of it. Reagan and Bush, finished it, and then it kind of got away from people in the last 2 or 3 administrations. So it needs to be it needs to be trimmed a little bit. It's like a tree that's grown and clouded all the windows so you can't see outside. Yes, I think the most important thing was liberating from the clutches of the FDA the first biotech product to go to market. And it was important because I learned later from the chairman of the board and the founder of it, of Genentech, which was the first biotech company, that if I hadn't been able to liberate it within a month afterwards, Wall Street would have pulled the plug, and we might not have had a biotech industry for another 15 years. So that was important, and it involved having me. They asked me if I could do this. I was deeply involved with the regulatory process. Could I pull a Genentech's drug out? And I said it's very dangerous to do this, it's very difficult. When you're going for one drug from one company, from one industry, you can get into a lot of trouble because the press is very suspicious. But I was able to do it. There was a prequel to it, and this is, I'm not sure it's quite, what I did was quite the level of what I'm going to tell you, but penicillin was bottled up by its competitors for a decade. And it took World War II and a very sick British infantry in North Africa to get it to Churchill's attention, because the drug was available, but it wasn't being sold and had not been approved because its competitors had bottled it up. And the same thing was true when Genentech came along. The existing drugs were all chemical drugs, not biotech, and they didn't want the competition. Well, I think the takeaway, if there is one, is that you have to watch the regulators very, very carefully and keep them to the very narrow lanes that Congress put them in. And what's happened in recent years is development of legal doctrine, which is now being unwound, in the process of being unwound in the Supreme Court, that any time Congress spoke about a topic, it was almost automatic that it would grow and grow and grow well beyond anything Congress ever contemplated. And that needs to stop, and I think the Supreme Court's going to stop it. Well, it's really it's like being a tenured member of the faculty. You get into the civil service, you burrow in, and you can have a lifetime career. There are rules about shuffling senior service around, getting them out of jobs after so many years, but it's a permanent government. That's why it's sometimes referred to as the deep state or the administrative state, and it exists in foreign policy as well, and that's what Eisenhower warned about in his farewell address in 1958, I guess it was, 1960. Well, the deep state is the extent to which the 18 intelligence agencies have taken over so many functions without any regard to privacy or even protection of American secrets. We have a recent example of this now with the leaks about Ukraine, and that's very unfortunate, very, very unfortunate. But that's a offshoot of having an intelligence community that's too big, too many players, not necessary, too many opportunities to have fun on your terms, and not on the terms that benefit the American public. Well, that's a certain status level of promotion that civil servants can get if they're really good. And of course, my view would be the better they are, the less tenure you should give them. But because they really become the permanent government, and it's very difficult with the rules that now, that have ruled the development of regulation, which is necessary. Regulation is very important in some instances. I'm not against regulation per se, but when it gets out of hand, it's very bad. And Tocqueville made that observation back in 1830 or whenever he wrote. He said the danger is we will entangle ourselves in rules of red tape that will, tie us to the ground. And he was right. There's always an economic interest, yes. And it was Adam Smith's, I think, greatest nightmare was the notion that a small group of businessmen would ask the government to set up some regulation that looked like it was protecting the public, but it was really protecting the market share of the people asking for the regulation. And that's not a good practice. And it's something that Adam Smith, as I said, didn't like. And in fact, he didn't much like businessmen in general, because he thought they would, if given a half a chance, play games with the government for their own benefit. Adam Smith would say, "I told you so." And Tocqueville would say, "I told you so." Well, there was an election in 1980 which elected Ronald Reagan as president, George Bush as vice president. And he had a slot for a council. And so I was asked to take that slot. It was in many ways very lucky. My family knew his family. My father occasionally played golf with his father, who was a senator. And so when I was asked, it wasn't an unusual thing, but it happened by way of my previous employment, which was for a big business group called the Business Roundtable, which still exists as a powerful lobby group. And I had the general counsel of three great big companies telling me what I could do and what I couldn't do. That was a time when there were no emails. There wasn't even there was no way to communicate. Basically, I'd have a meeting every two weeks, and they'd tell me the parameters, broad parameters, and in between those 2 weeks, I had to wing it, and I wung it, or did it in a way that didn't ruin my reputation. And it turned out that one of the lawyers that I was working for, the general counsel of Eli Lilly, who had been a roommate of Bush's either at Andover or Yale or maybe both, and he had asked Bush to be on his board, or the board of Eli Lilly. And I came back from a sabbatical, in the middle of a sabbatical, when the 1980 election occurred. And there was a meeting at the Business Roundtable in New York, which I thought I'd go to, since I'd come back to vote and was in the country for a little bit. I was about to go out on a safari. And he came over to me at the meeting and sat down and said, "Can I sit next to you?" And I said, "What do you mean, can you sit next to me? You're my boss." And he said, "Well, okay, I've told George that if he doesn't hire you, I'm never going to speak to him again. And now I'm telling you, if you don't say yes, I'm never going to speak to you again." So that's how I got the job. But one of the things that I did that was very important, and not totally unrelated to the deep state, was the first Gulf War. President Bush, then president, not vice president, but then president. I stayed on for 12 years. There's only one individual ever who served longer at a high level in the White House than I did. And you'd never guess who it was, but it obviously was somebody who worked for Roosevelt. It was his press secretary, Steve Early. But I had 12 years, and he was determined to get Congress to declare war. It's called something different, authorization to use force. He was determined to do that. because it had not been done for Korea or for Vietnam, and he felt that it was a distortion of the Constitution, since the war powers rest very clearly in the Congress. So he was determined to get Congress to live up to its obligations, and I spent a lot of time on that. I spent more time on that with him when he was president than any other single issue. And it was a squeaker. It won in the Senate by only 1 or 2 votes, but it was a very important thing to do, and it's beginning to come back again. Congress is the only entity that can declare war, and it's been hiding behind the tree for 2 or 3 decades, and it's time to get it to come out and play its part, which is the most important power that it has. Well, they do act as judge, jury, and whatever. Yes, what Senator Kennedy did, what Justice Breyer did, was very straightforward, very legitimate, never abused, and I don't think the next 2 presidents abused it, but it did get out of hand, and it's now got to be pruned, as I said. You got to cut the extraneous leaves and branches. They create these agencies, and then Congress creates the agencies, and then goes to sleep. One wonders why it is. There are many explanations for it. When I was in the government, it ran as it should have run, but it quickly went downhill. I don't think that President Clinton was the person who started the disintegration of the proper running of regulation, but it did begin to fray after his presidency. I have a case against the FDA, and they've been, as I think I described, a problem because they have almost unreviewable authority. It's very hard for a judge to question the scientific, quote-unquote, judgment of the FDA. And we didn't do that. We sued them for telling the public that they couldn't use a certain drug which they had previously approved for use. And once the drug is approved for one use, it's approved for any use, unless that use is dangerous. Well, in this case, there were 2 or 3 or maybe more drugs that could have done as well, or maybe better, in retrospect, better than the vaccines. And there are doctors, very, very, Yale professors, whatever, who believe that, tens of thousands of people died because the FDA was banning or trying to ban this bill, and it succeeded in doing it.
So what is the drug that you're suing over?
It's called ivermectin. Well, they did a tweet and a bunch of publications which basically said don't use it for the COVID, when it in fact has a very strong record of being successful. How would I characterize what I'm trying to correct?
Yeah.
A misleading condemnation of a very powerful pro-health drug, which is used all around the world for decades without causing any harm and doing a great deal of good. And there are statues celebrating it at the World Bank and in WHO, the World Health Organization. So we're not talking here about some fly-by-night thing. It's something which has been used and used successfully, and is now still being used successfully in many countries of the world. Only it's not available, really been made available in this country. I mean, I didn't know anything about it until I was asked, and if there had been nothing to it, I wouldn't have done it. But I was persuaded that it was extremely important to to keep the industry alive and to have this drug available. It's still used frontline. It was originally developed for heart attacks. I think they found better drugs for that, but I think it's still frontline treatment for strokes.
Right.
It's a blood thinner. It's a blood clot buster. Well, I'm suffering from, still suffering from blood clots that I developed in my lungs, which can only be explained by the vaccine, since when I developed the clots, I was already on a blood thinner having to do with certain heart remedies. And so it was a very disturbing discovery to find these things. And now we know, it's not been made public by the mainstream media, but we know there is massive evidence about the tendency of these drugs, the mRNA spike protein drugs, to it's a pro-coagulant. That is, it fosters the development of blood clots. It's led to, ultimately through a chain of events, to pneumonia, which I got, and I'm now trying to recover.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been a very long slog. My advice to you is don't get pneumonia if you can possibly avoid it. And if you do get it when you're young. I think it would be best to avoid the vaccines too.
Yeah.
I hope that the Supreme Court can act as a correction and bring the law back to where it should be, or where it was, not that long ago. And what will come out in the process, if that can be allowed to run its course, what will come out is all the dangers of having big business and big government combined to run the show. And I'm rereading Herman Wouk's great novel called Winds of War, and the second volume was War and Remembrance. And this is what Nazi Germany developed into. Big business teaming up with big government, and it's really a recipe for socialism. It's a recipe for fascism. It's a recipe for communism. It's a very bad thing to get into, and it ultimately blew up in Hitler's face, and hopefully we'll correct it before it blows up in our face. Well, the UN, I don't know that it's really lived up to its promise, and maybe that was just inevitable. International organizations are, I think, good to have, but the more important thing is to have buy-in to the culture. I think having someone setting the rules for trade is good. I think there are all kinds of, IMF is good, backstops for the economy are good, but it can get too far, and if there's a gang up of like-minded countries like Russia and China and Iran, and if the West is so feckless that it lets that happen, then we have a divided world, which is much more dangerous than just a divided government of the United States. But the Federal Reserve, I think, has not lived up to its reputation, and I'm willing to bet that we had less inflation. I mean, there were slumps. There's no question about that. There were recessions, but we've had recessions since the Federal Reserve. So, in fact, we had a Great Depression. So I don't know that the Federal Reserve has added much, except for trouble on the inflationary front. And it'd be best to try to find a way to get it back to what the founders thought they were doing. But the Federal Reserve, in a sense, is just a private bank, or a series of private banks. And they ought not to be running the show. It ought to be people elected by the public and responsible to the public.